1 Corinthians chapter 11, we are picking up with verse 26, which is the close, really, of the previous verses that we looked at last week. What we saw in verses 23 through 25, which are very familiar to most of us, I think, is the institution of the Lord's Supper by Jesus, and therefore a reference to what you see in the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, of where he does this. And so Paul, having learned it from Jesus, but not being at that supper, now he comes back and he is bringing this up as what Jesus did to institute it on the eve of his death, which really is the center of what it is about, as we've seen. But I think that it's important for us, before we move on, to understand a little bit of a hermeneutical difference, if you will, an interpretive difference, how we see these things. When this opened in verse 17, and we saw all the way through verse 22, it introduced the problem, the situation that existed there in Corinth, and why this was not right. So he's now making the correction, and to make the correction, he goes back to the beginning of when it was instituted. And so he does this, and what follows now is a little bit of elaboration and explanation from that is directly applying to the situation he brought up in verses 17 through 22. So 17 through 22 is the problem that we already know he has a problem with, because he says he cannot commend them. Remember that contrast between what he did at the beginning of the previous section with the veils, and now this one, can't commend you because of your behavior. Here's how you're behaving. That's an issue. Why is it an issue? Because this is actually what Jesus instituted, verses 23 through 25. And everything that after that then is a correction. Now, here's what I mean by understanding the hermeneutics of it. That is just the argumentation. Whenever you're looking at what Scripture is telling us and providing, and it's giving us examples of what people were doing, and then what's happening because of that, you have to figure out, when the authority is rather generally offered, you have to understand what category it falls into. Is it instituting a behavior, which is what Jesus had already done, and therefore is brought up again here? It's instituting a behavior. It could be incidental things. For example, we've already seen, and it's going to come up again, the emphasis on the houses, but you have to make sure you understand in its context what the point he's making is about bringing up the not eating in your homes, and that is actually not an institution of a regulation itself. It's not saying this is commanded, thou shalt only eat in your home. That's not its context, but rather that is actually incidental to the argument itself. But the main aspect of this, especially when you're dealing with what is to be understood now as generic and specific authority. I know it gets technical a little bit, but it really makes a difference when you see the way things play out in different scriptures. When you have something said very specifically, the question is there anything more generically said about that? If not, then that is as generic as it gets, and that's the way it needs to be. But when you have something that is generically given or given somewhere else, you have to figure out what all is said as a whole to understand its place. Remember when we noticed, when it said gathering together, that the time of when they were to gather together is not mentioned in this passage. That is given in Acts 20 and verse 7. So in terms of the institution of the Lord's Supper, you have Jesus instituting it, but not telling them the when. Later providing the when, really the day of Pentecost, but not recorded for us until Acts 20 and verse 7. But with Corinth, what you have is regulating the Lord's Supper based upon problems that were there. So everything that is said here is saying, okay, here's the core. He goes back to the beginning. Here is what it's about. Here's what is to be done, and this is why it is to be done. He's then comparing their behavior that he gave in verses 17 through 22. And he's basically saying, here's what Jesus did. Now we're going to talk about how what you're doing doesn't match the reason why Jesus did this. Do you remember that he said the way he approached it was, when you're gathering together, this is not to partake of the Lord's Supper. You've got the wrong purpose in what you're doing. You may have some unleavened bread and some grape juice out, but the reason why is not right. And that needs to be regulated. It needs to be fixed to fall in line with the purpose that was given and corrected in that way. And so you have the general idea of, okay, remember, if it was just something that was said, remember the Lord's death. If that was all that was ever said, well, that's very generic. But that's not what. When he said, remember me, he was giving it in this way. So it's a much tighter institution to do these specific things. Now, there's a context to that as far as the purpose. But here, what's been provided is the Corinthians hadn't gathered that from the implications of when it was given and the why of just his words, and therefore they need to be kind of pulled in by having Paul lay out some things and offer some regulation to it. All he's really doing is elaborating on what was implied by what Jesus said. Okay? So that's the technical kind of understanding of where we are in the text. So when you look at verse 26 now, he's going to close this statement off. He's just gone in and talked about what Jesus did on the night in which he was betrayed in instituting the Lord's Supper with the unleavened bread, with the fruit of the vine. And now he adds this, verse 26. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes. This is a good example of what we just said about he doesn't mention the specific time. For as often as. You don't, well, what, just whenever it's on your own? This is the problem when people will come solely to this passage to understand everything about the Lord's Supper. It doesn't actually provide all that you need. It's not whenever you feel like it. That's not what's said. It's as often as. It just doesn't give you the time because that's already given elsewhere. That, notice, they're not having problems with the time. That's not part of the problem that the Corinthians had, so he doesn't need to address that part. He's regulating their problems and fixing their problems. We know elsewhere what the timing is to be. So he's just making a reference to what they already knew and what they were doing correctly here. As often as. As often as you eat this bread and drink this cup. Now, it's a small thing to say this each time, but when they do that, if there's something about it, he's saying, this bread, this cup. He's wanting to make sure it's drawn attention to not the items, but the purpose. It's the cup of the Lord. It's the bread that represents the body of the Lord. That's what he's saying. This bread, this cup. When you're doing it for this purpose and you're doing these things, something else happens. And that is, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes. We take that simple statement for granted, don't we? We proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Those seem to be rather far apart in thought, aren't they? What exactly then are we proclaiming? The reason why this has such significance of what was accomplished, which we went over last week, about God became man and therefore had a body. That this God who took on a human body chose to die as a sacrifice and give his blood to create a new covenant with man where all could be right with him and be his people. This big. What gave it its power is the fact that though he died, yet he lives. So we're remembering then the cost. Okay, that's where we start. We're remembering what it cost, which was the death. And that's what we are to proclaim. We're making a proclamation. The word is, it's an announcement. If this wording has the idea of getting this message out. We're letting people know that Jesus did this for us. That's why it's so significant. That's why it's every first day of the week. That's why we do it together. It is a joint worship as a proclamation that this is core to who we are. Because of what it encompasses. It encompasses the fact of the incarnation, that God became man. Huge doctrinal point. I know we just take these things for granted. You realize that in the world, you are outnumbered in terms of believing that. God became man. And God died on a cross for you. And in doing so, gave us, and with that authority, instituted the creation of and establishment of a new covenant of what he was going to do for us with new hope, which is eternal life, until he comes. So our declaration in the Lord's Supper is the extent to which God was willing to go to help us be right with him. And therefore, it is solemn in terms of what it costs God, with implications for what that should make us think about what we should do, who we are, and what it means for us. Because that last part, we're to do this until he comes. Which is, just to make sure we clarify, the second coming into the world, nothing more. You think, why does he have to say that? Well, there are some that want to put it a lot earlier. We are remembering what he did in providing us salvation, the fact that he came, and this new covenant, and all of this, and that's going to go on and must go on until he comes, and that's it. That's the second coming. That's Judgment Day. So we have how long to do this? And that also, by the way, there's another thing that tells you. It tells you that this covenant he sets up is in force and is the covenant until that time. And there's not another one that's going to come in on addendum to it, because this is the one in force until he returns. Now, this one little verse then that's about the Lord's Supper actually undermines multiple doctrines in this world that claim to be Christian. Now, let's then go from this, and why do I go repeat all that? Because of understanding what he's going to say next. Therefore, verse 27, whoever eats this bread or drinks this cup of the word in an unworthy of the Lord, in an unworthy manner, will be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. Well, what does it take to do that? What is he talking about? The right attitude. Be more specific even than that. I mean, it would be wrong to take something, to come and do it the wrong way than what Jesus instituted. But in this context, it is, why are you doing this, right? So your attitude. But he's already given us specifically an example of what the problem is, right? So in direct context, he said what the Corinthians were doing was doing it in an unworthy manner. What then were they doing wrong? Just in principle. Their attitude, yes. Good. They were making a common meal, but let's even cut that one word off. They were making it common. They were treating something that was to be as reverent a reflection as ever there can be. And they were being flippant about it. They weren't making it about the remembrance. They were making it about the meal. And therefore they were taking the meaning out. Now, I want you to think about the implications of this just generally and get back, and I don't have to go into as much because of a recent Eddie lesson. We have a role in worship. We have to insert purpose on our own to make worship what it needs to be. Just being in the right place with all the things corporately being done around us is not sufficient to make our worship right. So let's say we were going to take the meal part out of it from Corinth. If they still were just to take the Lord's Supper and they were just kind of to la-di-da it, that'd still be just as wrong. Because they weren't doing it for the reasons and in the way, for the purpose for which it was given. And so I hope we understand from this, is what we're going to see as we move through, that taking the Lord's Supper is far more than, okay, we have a prayer, eat a cracker. Have a prayer, drink a little bit of juice. Done. That's just as vulgar as what the Corinthians were doing. Because we just sucked all the spirituality out of it. So when he says to eat this bread or drinks this cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner, will be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord, bringing up both things, right, of why he came, to fail to take the opportunity to think about what God did in the incarnation and on the cross. This is the moment. Every week, this is the moment of the week. And to consider, put no thought into it. Not really consider this had to happen for me. And that this is something that is, I need to be reminded of. He's going to get to the reasons more in a moment, but it's always going to be needed. This reminder is always going to be needed. That's the other implication of the end of verse 26. There's not going to be a time that we won't need this reminder. So because of this, verse 28, but let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. Now, notice carefully then what you see in the difference. When you get to verse 28, it says that really it's a but conjunction. So that's saying that there's a relationship between what he's saying here and what he just said. A little bit of contrast. Well, what's the contrast? The contrast is between an unworthy manner and an examining manner. He's giving you the correction, the regulation. He's giving you the correction of the unworthy manner by saying what you need to do is be examining yourself. But what does that mean? Examine yourself. Okay. I had to check out earlier. I had something on my sleeve. Not exactly what we're talking about, is it? All right. This word, we do have to just determine words because he's using different ones that are very similar. This is the one of putting yourself to a test of genuineness. It's the same word that's translated prove in 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 21. Prove all things. Same word. With the idea of, I need to be going through, why am I doing this? What is this about? I need to be doing a good personal inventory of why this was needed for me. That it was for me. So that we can just take in and be in awe of that every week. There should be a time where that becomes old hat, to take that message in, and that I am testing whether or not I'm really thinking like I should about what God has done for me, what Jesus did for me. Examine himself. Walk yourself through the paces, and what do you need to kind of trim off and that I'm not appreciating here about what Jesus did. So in this manner, that's the so. This is how, essentially, he should eat of the bread and drink of the cup. So in the unworthy manner, if we've got an unworthy manner first, and then he comes back and says, and here's the proper manner, a examining manner. Okay, that's the difference. Then we understand immediately that we've got, it needs to be a real thoughtful, intense kind of thought and process, rather than a quick blanking of the mind. Seeing Jesus on the cross, yes. Seeing why, even more important. Devin. Yeah. I think you're right that we don't appreciate when people try to pull this thing because we're going to add more meaning to it. That means actually we've lost the meaning of it, and that instead the whole idea is that we need that regularly to be reminded of this week. Jesus died for me to live this week for him, and that we ought to regularly be placing that as part of how we're thinking. People come up with all sorts of reasoning and explanations of why. There's not a good reason to say it's more spiritual because I'm ignoring what God says. That's never a really good sentence to utter. If you decide you're going to do it a different way than God, and therefore you know best, that just doesn't work. So, but get down and understand, though, the motive behind it, the nature of how you're looking, and you're testing yourself. Am I really letting this sink in? Become part of me? And not just in the moment, but also the whole idea is, as David's pointing out, is that to really let it become me. Okay, let's follow this up. He's still in the same idea of verse 29. Because now he's going to explain, going to give a kind of a summation. This is for... He who eats and drinks in an unworthy manner eats and drinks judgment to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. So here there are consequences. If in the sense verse 27, you're guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. Why? Because you're treating it as if, for a Christian who became a Christian on the foundation of faith that Jesus is the Son of God, who is God in the flesh, who died on the cross for our sins. That's the core of why you become a Christian. That's the faith. That's the core part of the faith. And now you're going to take that, which is the most essential part. Everything flows from it. And we're going to take that from that and to remember this core part of our faith that we are proclaiming to everyone, and that we're going to just kind of treat it as nothing, what are we doing to our faith? If we're treating the Lord's Supper in a flippant way, then what are we saying about our own faith? And therefore, there is guilt because you're saying, this isn't as important to me as I said when I obeyed the gospel. That's what we're saying. So if the guilt is found in verse 27, verse 29 is the judgment, the consequences of that guilt. When you eat or drink in an unworthy manner, you're eating and drinking, that is, by the way in which you're doing it the wrong way, you're taking in judgment to himself, it says, not discerning the Lord's body. These are related words, but the whole idea of that just by treating the Lord's Supper, which is about his death, in a it's kind of the same thing for a proclamation of our faith as Christians, that our original expression of faith and obedience was to become Christians. And this is now the statement where we are regularly as a unit expressing, we've all done this, we all believe this all is the core of who we are now. Well, if we're going to toss that aside as not having that real meaning in our lives, what is the consequence of that? If you're saying that's not what I really think is important about my life. And we can kind of look at it as some others say, well, but this is just one small thing. How are we deciding that this is one small thing? What do we just call a small thing? The remembrance of what Jesus did for us? That's part of the problem. Not discerning the Lord's body. The word discerning is related to it's interesting, it's related to the word judgment, but it's picking up on the idea of what he has said about examine. Examine is your role in doing all this, and then the discernment is you're clearly not thinking things through enough to pick up on what really matters about all this. You're not looking at what the Lord has done and seeing anything in it. So verse 30, he's going to draw a conclusion of what happens as a result of this. For this reason, many are weak and sick among you, and many sleep. Now, all three of those are actually a little bit euphemistic. That is, they're kind of a nicer way of saying what the situation is. Because if you're weak, okay, you don't have the spiritual strength to do this. That's the first option. You don't have the spiritual strength to concentrate on the Lord's death and what he has done and what he accomplished, what it means for this very short time once a week. You don't have the spiritual strength to do that. Or it says you're sick. This is the idea of someone that is really bad off. You know, you're apparently you're just incapable for whatever reason of doing this. Now, there's a little bit of irony in use here because that's not the problem. Or at least not as a whole, or he wouldn't have said what he did at the very beginning. So at the last phrase, he says, and many sleep. Now, this has been taken a couple of ways. How would you think you could have the idea of that they're asleep? They're just oblivious. Yeah, they're just kind of oblivious. I mean, it could be even to the point of they're spiritually dead. But at the very least, he's dealing with people that their mind is not engaged at all. So you can go anywhere from their mind is, and when you put that together, what we just said about the consequences of your mind not being engaged, is there consequences that are spiritual consequences, then it kind of ties in with being spiritually dead too, for that reason. Let me sleep. Is that we kind of give ourselves reasons to why during this time we're not there. Why do you think that is hard? Why do you think it's hard? Can we just say, it's not always the easiest thing? What does it say? We have trouble concentrating for 2 minutes about the most important event in history. Notice I didn't say do we, I just said why do we? Because say it again. Well, is that we always, in some cases, it's just hard to concentrate, period, isn't it? Can be. Unless something else, we also have a lot of stuff passively. We did a lot of passive stuff to kind of keep us engaged, to keep our attention. So we kind of almost need help to keep our attention, and this is about us letting what Jesus did keep our attention. Brock? Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're in a world where there's all these distractions, and what do we do on Sunday morning? We eliminate the distractions, and then we don't know what to do. This isn't normal. You got that? Oh, yeah. No. Okay. I do think that routine is part of it. And it takes mental effort, and that's a different thing, because it's not like you're trying to figure out a problem. Okay, some of y'all have jobs and that's what you do. You have to try to figure out a problem. That's not what this either. It's the problem was figured out for you. Edie. That's strategy right there, everyone. Yeah, look, there are different things that we may have to do. Well, Gideon and I like to read Scripture or close my eyes and really think hard about what is before me. And that's partly going to be about personality, so I don't think that'd be right to dictate particular approaches, but the end is clearly required. We have to get ourselves there. And whatever we're doing together is designed to help us get there. But we have an individual responsibility to get ourselves there in this process. Here's why. Verse 31. For if we would judge ourselves, we would not be judged. I don't think this is as hard as it looks at the front end, even though there is a little bit different. The first word is actually the same one where he said discerning. If you discerned yourselves, you would not be judged. I think that's a little bit better. I don't know what another translation maybe has on it. But the whole idea is if you would do your part, if you would up front put in the effort that you're supposed to, remembering what it's about, and put yourself into that, you wouldn't need someone else coming on to point out how you're falling short and how messed up your situation is. The reason why you have a judgment being existed out from the outside is you got it wrong, right? I don't like going through and marking, my red pen on the students' papers, but they got it wrong. If they didn't get it wrong, I wouldn't have to mark, right? All right, good. So it's the being the wrong that creates that. Well, so he's going through here and saying, okay, if we take care of that ourselves, then no one else is going to have to come in and make that correction and regulate us. But guess what? That's not what y'all are doing. You're not taking care of those things yourself, Corinthians. So someone has to tell you. So what do you do when that comes up? Verse 32. But when we are judged, we are chastened by the Lord, that we may not be condemned with the world. Now, this is actually a very generic statement that could be, in principle, applied to a lot of things, but it's here in this context. Because he's talked about how their failure to properly partake of the Lord's Supper is a serious matter for which they will be judged. Guilty. So you need to, instead of wait around for someone to correct, you need to make the correction. But when we are judged, okay, it had to come up to point out that there was a problem. When that happens, what is actually going on? We are chastened by the Lord. That's really important as part of this. The word chasten, what is, you think of chasten, that's kind of an old sounding word, isn't it? How many of you chasten your children? It's nice and alliterative. No one says that. This is the word, it is related to the idea of discipline, training, in making those corrections with the whole idea, okay, of this word, to train and to discipline, is to get someone to the point of where they don't need it anymore. Isn't that what training and discipline are all about? You're trying to get people, it's wrong, it's got to be corrected, but the goal is not, I have to come and correct you all the time. The goal is, you get it down so I don't have to worry about it. And that's what he's kind of using here. When we're judged, when we have, and this, notice where the judgment's coming from. He went back and had, now they find the bell. Okay, so we come through and we go back and we're going to get back to it. And he says, we're going to be chastened because we're being judged, but in that process, it's by the Lord. All Paul is doing is bringing up, here's what the Lord said to do. That's not what you're doing. That's not what you're fitting. You're not fitting what the Lord said. And that is the core idea of what any one of our corrections is. It's the basis upon which, on the whole, that you see most of the letters written. They're written to deal with things, sometimes to offer additional depth of explanation, but often to deal with problems they had, to regulate and put things back in order, to chasten and train. But the purpose of that is important. The writer of Hebrews deals with this in chapter 12, and that is that we may not be condemned with the world. What's the purpose to correct something that's wrong? To avoid the consequences of being wrong. Right? It's no one's, let me see, I'm trying to look at the crowd here. When someone says, Boeing, we've got a problem with your design, that's not someone picking on Boeing. It says, people are going to die here. That's a consequence. That's not good. Okay? So you come up with any of these kind of things, the same thing is true. We need to correct it. Okay? So we need to make sure that we don't want to be in a situation where we're condemned with the world. We don't want to be in that boat again. And notice what he is doing is he's kind of saying, that's where you place yourself by the lack of faith you're showing. You're kind of acting the same. You're acting in a frivolous manner toward what the Lord did. That's what the world does. Go all the way back to chapter 1. Their way they thought about the cross. So, what do we need to do with all of this? Verse 33. Therefore, my brethren, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. Now, for this, you have to go all the way back to that previous section, the very beginning of this, of what they were doing wrong there. What were they doing? They were coming together in their little groups. Some who had the food and everything, they were just coming together and, all right, all of us are together, whatever, those other guys will take care of themselves, and we're going to do this, and then we're out of here. And like, that's not right. And that's what this is addressing when he says, therefore, my brethren, when you come together to eat, and this is in context, Lord's Supper, partaking of the Lord's Supper, wait for one another. What is he saying? There is a need. It should be about the whole of the congregation, because it's a whole expression of the faith of the whole of the congregation. That's the point, that it is a united joint effort that we should be waiting on one another so we can do it together. That's what he's saying. Lynn? Mm-hmm. Yep. No, you're right. This was a symptom of the larger problem he dealt with in chapters 1 through 4. No, yeah, what? It was the manner, but that was affected, right? So usually most spiritual things are interconnected. And one verse, so close. And I'm not going to be here next week. Preaching the gospel, in this case in Missouri. PTP begins on Wednesday, and I've got a full slate, so don't know what they've got planned for you, but it's not me. So I will see you in 2 weeks.